as I say, it is May 21st, and this is a very, very special day in Israel, especially perhaps in Jerusalem, but throughout Israel, and a special day to Jewish folk throughout the world, and to those who embrace and delight in what God is doing in and through the people of Israel, even today, because today is Jerusalem Day, and I want to begin by talking about that. And it's rather near and dear to my heart, I admit, but by the same token, I want to relate it, at least in my fevered mind, to our focus today, because we're making our way, are focusing on the life of Christ, and we have come to a uh, we're at this point in our series, we're just focusing on sort of the big picture. And what I like to think about today is Jesus as the master teacher. And specifically, as a matter of fact, I have entitled the session, Jesus the Master Teacher Tackles a Really Difficult Lesson. And we've kind of adumbrated this as we've talked about how Jesus, late in his ministry, began to teach his disciples that he was going to die, and the difficulty and the patience and perseverance with which he ministered that lesson to his disciples. But there's a very closely related issue, and that's what I want to talk about in just a bit this morning. But I'm going to relate it to uh, Jerusalem Day. And because tonight, as the sun goes down, it'll be Jerusalem Day. And that is it's not a biblical feast. It is celebrating a remarkable modern event, and that is the recapture of Jerusalem in June of 1967 as a result of the Six-Day War. And very, very quickly, the Jewish government has identified this day as a day to especially celebrate the memory of when the city of Jerusalem was taken once again. Uh, of course, in 1948, Israel won its War of Independence, but there was a portion of the land which was under Arab control and was annexed by Jordan. And from 1948 until 1967, I think you probably know this, the Jerusalem was a divided city. It was a thoroughly divided city. There was a wall. It was an armored wall, barbed wire, machine guns. It was a Berlin Wall type arrangement between East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem, and the old city, by the way, the city that the part of the city of Jerusalem that we most celebrate, and we love to visit, and we love to study, and we love to enjoy, and so on. That was entirely inaccessible. It was in Jordan, but in 1967. As one of the remarkable consequences of the most amazing military series of events, I think, probably in human history. The city of Jerusalem was taken by the IDF, the Israel Defense Force, and of course today the city is united. And so on this day, and let me just say, you may wonder, well, why don't they do it on the day it happened in June? Well, remember that Israel has a lunar calendar, and so they are marking the day on their lunar calendar, but their lunar calendar doesn't stay entirely synchronized with our 12-month solar calendar. So I won't get into that, but at any rate, this is the day that they celebrate it, and I'd like to, and by the way, it's interesting, the Six-Day War. And as I understand it, Ariel Sharon, one of the most important generals in that war, was given the honor of naming the war, and he named it the Six-Day War because, of course, it did happen for 6 days, but in 6 days. Oh, don't get me started. But the point is that he honored it in remembrance of that is, he named it thus in remembrance of the 6 days of creation, because just as God in 6 days birthed the world, so in those remarkable 6 days in June of 1967, Israel as a nation, as a state, was given rebirth as they captured their city and so on. Now, I'm going to play you a video, and I hope this works. I've worked at it and tried to figure out how to do it. There is a movie, and I would really recommend it to you. It's called I Am Israel, and it is all of that. It's a celebration of the modern state of Israel. But one of the realities, and this is where I want to take you ultimately, one of the realities that is so manifest on this movie is the emphasis upon the fact that what is happening in Israel today and what has been happening since the late 1800s and what happened most dramatically in 1948 with the War of Independence when the state of Israel was reborn by the consent of the international political community, by careful dicta and so on. The state of Israel was reborn. And then in 1967, as they captured Jerusalem and united that holy city and so on, that what is going on today in Israel, and the point is on this video, there is remarkable, in my mind, acknowledgement that what is going on is in fact the fulfillment of divine prophecies. As a matter of fact, I'm going to do one other thing. And honest to goodness, we're going to talk about the life of Jesus. And you know, I've entrapped you into one of my hobby horses here, but let me take you to a couple of passages that are really remarkable, where God anticipates this rebirth of Israel. Now listen, when I have opportunity to get people in Israel, and man, am I anxious to do that again, but when I have that opportunity, I was supposed to have 10 trips this year, but they all kind of went up in smoke. Not all of them. We have one. We actually took one in January and one in February. Whoa, we were just under the wire. A lovely trip, and we've got one in October and one in early November. So, but at any rate, when I'm in Israel, I really work at helping people understand that what they are seeing as they drive down those modern highways, as they see those burgeoning, bustling cities, as they look over the beautiful verdant hillsides with all of the crops and the agriculture, what they're seeing is an absolutely astounding fulfillment of specific prophecies in the Old Testament. Two prophecies. Because number one, God gave the amazing prophecy that the fruitful land, the land of milk and honey, to which God had brought Israel and in which he had planted Israel, was by reason of their covenant fecklessness and faithlessness, by reason of the fact that they refused to honor Yahweh as their God and their king. God was going to carry them off to another country, and the land was going to become desolate. And it did. It became absolutely desolate, unlivable, tiny, tiny population, hillsides so barren, so dry, so unfruitful. It was staggering. And it was the universal opinion that not only would it never support a significant population, but there was the almost universal, I'm talking in the early part of late part of the 1800s, early part of the 1900s, there was the almost universal persuasion that it never did, that the Bible was making things up when it talked about the marvelous civilizations and cultures and trade and so on that were there. And one of the impulses of the very, very early archaeological historical efforts in Israel was to prove, honestly, you can see this in Barbara Tuchman's book, Bible and Swords. She makes much of this, that there was the persuasion that we ought to treat the Bible like it claims to be history. We should treat it like history, and we should examine it. We shouldn't treat it with kid gloves. So organizations were sent there and basically to demonstrate that the Old Testament story of huge, vibrant civilizations and trade and so on could not possibly be true, because the land wouldn't support it. But every time they stuck a spade in the ground, they discovered that there were, in fact, records, undeniable artifactual records of these marvelous civilizations. And that became part of the impulse for the Zionist movement to come back. So my point is, God made two promises in the Old Testament. Number one, he promised, because of your fecklessness, Israel, I'm going to take you out of this land. And this land is going to become such a desolation that people will be amazed at its absolute emptiness. But then he makes another promise that he's going to bring them back. And that's happening. Now, I say way too much and I'm using too much time, but I'm going to try this. So hang in here. I hope the sound works. But I want to play a video, and this is just a clip from this movie, I Am Israel. And it's really a delightful movie. I'd recommend it to you. You can find it. But let me find the... All right, now if I go, hold on here. All right, I believe you should have this, but I'm going to make it big. Now, let me try this.
I think we have a privilege of seeing with our own eyes the words of the book materializing and becoming a reality. In the history of mankind, there has never been a nation that has left its homeland and returned to its homeland. Not after 2,000 years.
In 1916, when my grandfather first moved to Israel, there were 60,000 Jews in Israel. Exactly 100 years later, there are over 6 million. Never in the world has there been a population explosion from 60,000 to 6 million as we've seen here in the land of Israel. It's unprecedented. Something is happening of historic proportions.
The world's actually constantly going through changes, but I think we're experiencing a hyper switch. Something's moving quicker.
We're living in times of prophecy. It says, I will bring you in from the four corners of the earth, and people will know that you are my people and that I am your God.
Here we see something so epic, so huge, so historic, promised in the Bible.
It's something that people couldn't have imagined 50 years ago.
God says in Jeremiah, no more am I going to be known as the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. I'm going to be known as the God who brought you out of the land of the north and the other countries. And when he brought back the people from the land of the north, from Russia, he was saying something else. He's saying, no more am I going to be known as the God of history. I'm going to be known as the God of now. Open up your eyes, watch what's happening. I'm on the move.
There are more Jews studying the Bible today than ever before in Israel's history. Every single promise is now coming to pass in our lifetime. And what that does is it inspires people to want to be a part of it. They feel a calling in their life to say, if God is with Israel, then either I'm moving to Israel or I'm standing with Israel. I'm helping Israel. I'm supporting Israel. I want to be a part of that.
Some truly feel I have the opportunity to be part of what God is doing in this land. And that doesn't only mean Jews. That means those that stand with God wherever they are.
When Isaiah said that all the nations will be streaming like water to the Temple Mount, he was talking about you. From Missouri, from Washington, from California, from Brazil, from Tunisia, from Indonesia. If you want to connect to the essence of the whole thing, the place where God chose to lay his divine presence, you got it. This is it.
With the dawn of each new day, life is returning to the land of the Bible. And around the world, millions of believers are feeling drawn to this place. Now is the time to chart your own journey, to discover for yourself the miracle of the land and the courageous hearts of the people of Israel.
I am 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 Israel. I am Israel. I am Israel.
Now, once again, it's absolutely stunning that there is a land of Israel today, that it is prosperous, growing. It's amazing, and it is amazing as a fulfillment of divine prophecy. Let me take you to a couple of passages. I was going to do this before the clip, and I forgot, so I'm going to take you back to the scriptures. And in Jeremiah 16, and this verse was referenced, this is amazing, where God's Jeremiah, who's a prophet of the exile, that is the immediately before the exile, but he is prophesying there in Jerusalem, and he has prophesied the destruction that's going to befall them because of their covenant faithlessness. But then he goes on to say, behold, listen to this. This is stunning. It was quoted on the video. Therefore, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord. It'll no more be said, the Lord lives who brought up the children of Israel from the land of Egypt, but the Lord lives who brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north and from all the lands where he had driven them. I will bring them back into their land, which I gave to their fathers. And he goes on to say again and again, this is not about the worth or the worthiness or the desert of the Jewish people. It's about God's covenant faithfulness. And he says all throughout the Old Testament, when God wants, when a prophet wants to appeal to Yahweh as the God who can get it done, the God whose strength is sufficient for whatever task he undertakes, it's always the God who brought you up out of Egypt, the God who bared his arm and brought you out of Egypt. But Jeremiah says, you know what? That's going to be almost forgotten. As people remember Yahweh, they acknowledge Yahweh not as the God who brought them out of Egypt 1,400 years before Christ, but the God who brought them back to the land after hundreds and a couple of thousand years of the land being deserted and so on. That is stunning. And I believe with all my heart we're seeing it happen. Let me take you one other passage, Ezekiel 36. Now listen, 37. I'm going to take you to 37. This is part of that grand prophetic package we have here in 36 and 37, even into 38 and 39. But the fact is that this is a new covenant passage, and God is saying that, just as in Jeremiah 31, he talked about this new covenant, which was not like the covenant which he made at Sinai. Here he calls it a covenant of peace. And he says he is going to put his spirit, he's going to redeem, he's going to regenerate a generation of Israelites. And then he after making that promise in Ezekiel 36, he kind of sets out the way he's going to do it in this very, very familiar dry bones passage. But let me read it to you. And again, I'm setting you up for, I'll just jump ahead. My point is simply this, that late in Jesus' ministry, he begins to teach that he's going to die, but there's another part to that. There's a concomitant message. And quite frankly, that concomitant message is I think just as difficult, if not as painful, but it is just as difficult to embrace as the fact that he's going to die. And that is that he's going to depart and come again. And the Bible lays this out. And we see something of it happening. I'm not a date setter. All right, I'll come back to that. But the point is, just think about what he says here. He says, this is Ezekiel. Again, he's contemporary to Jeremiah, late contemporary. He's living in Babylon during the exile. He is surrounded every day of his life by evidence of God's covenant-keeping character, because God had said, I'm going to rip you out of your land and send you to a land where they worship gods of wood and stone. And sure enough, Israel, the Jews, many of them are living in Babylon. And yet, in the midst of the exile, Ezekiel is given a prophecy of the dry bones. Now, let me read it to you here. I got to hurry. The hand of the Lord came upon me, and he brought me out in the spirit. Here we are in this fourth dimension. This is real, but it's in a spirit world and so on that we've talked about before. He brought me out in the spirit of the Lord, and he set me down in the midst of the valley, and the valley was full of bones, and he caused me to pass by them all around. So imagine Ezekiel made to walk kind of tiptoeing through this valley of dry bones, human bones, skeletal bones. And behold, there were very many in the open valley, and they were very dry. Folks, that's Israel, the land of Israel, the land that was called Palestine. Don't get me started. But that land, that Levant, the eastern and the Mediterranean world, the land which was from the Mesopotamia to the river of Egypt and to the brook of Egypt, and from the Jordan to the Mediterranean, that land which was explicitly given to Abram. Go to Genesis, where God gets Abram to a spot. I love to take people to this spot, and said, look to the south, look to the north, look to the east, look, all that you see, the land is yours. That land was given to Israel. And he said it was a rich land, a fertile land, a verdant land. But it had become desolate. It had become a valley of dry bones in Israel itself. But listen to this. So they were dry, and he said to me, God said, Son of man, can these bones live? This is such an interesting pedagogical experiment or exercise. God's trying to make a point. He says, what do you think? Look at all those dry bones. Can they come back to? And I can imagine Ezekiel sitting there and saying, of course they can't, but I'm talking to God here, and God can do that. So he looks up and he says, oh, Lord God, you know. And so now God gives a remarkable prophecy, and he says, prophesy to these bones and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh Elohim to these bones, surely I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. Now listen to this. I'm going to put breath in you. This is spiritual life. But then he says this, I will put sinews on you and bring flesh upon you. I will cover your skin. I will cover you with skin and put breath in you. And then you shall live, and then you shall know that I am the Lord. So I prophesied. This is Ezekiel, as I was commanded. And as I prophesied, imagine this now, there was a noise. And suddenly a rattling. And these dry bones, these lifeless bones began to come together, bone to bone. And indeed, as I looked, the sinews and the flesh came upon them, and the skin covered them over. But notice the last phrase in verse 7, but there was no breath in them. So God is going to go on to describe how he's going to give breath. But the sinews and the skin, that is, it takes shape before the breath, before the spirit. By the way, breath and spirit are exactly the same word. And so it's talking about, now here's the point. This is where we are living. We are living right here. In that day when the sinew has the sinews and the muscles and here you have a land that's been reborn, and you have people who have come from 60,000 to 6 million. And by the way, today there are over 8 million. It was in 2016 that were about 2 that were on the video. But the point is, clearly, this is not an accident. It's never happened before. And I don't know the spiritual construct within which that film is made, to be honest with you. So I don't know, maybe there are believers in Yeshua who acknowledge, but who are behind it. I don't know. I don't think so. And yet you've got the recognition again and again, God is doing this. And so the point is, we are living in the day that Ezekiel described rather carefully. And Ezekiel 36 is the ultimate promise, because God's a covenant-keeping God. And he promised way back there in days of Abraham that he was going to raise up a nation of Israel, a generation of Israel that would embrace him and repent. And that's not come yet. It's not happened yet. It's going to happen at the end of times as a result of the end time drama that God puts together in order to bring Israel to the end of herself. But leaving that alone, the point is that Ezekiel reiterates this promise, I'm going to put my spirit in them. But then he goes on to describe the process. And as Ezekiel watches it happen, there is a time where the bones and the muscles and the sinew have come together, but they're not regenerate. The breath is not in them yet. And that's where we're living now. How soon that end time drama, which will bring Israel to the end of herself and a generation of Israel, all Israel will be saved, as Paul says in Romans 11, how soon? I have no idea. Sooner than it was yesterday, I'll tell you that. I used to sit under a preacher, Monk Parker, and I heard him say this a couple of times, and I loved it. He would say, it's wrong to set dates. But on the other hand, we do have a rather careful description, a really stunningly careful description in the scriptures of an end time drama. And that end time drama is going to happen on the stage of the world. And we can step back and look at the world and say, my, the props have never been so thoroughly in place. God is arranging the props. The curtain's going to go up and the drama is going to unfold, but God arranges the props. And at every generation, people have been saying, oh my, it seems like it could happen today. Yeah, that's how God orders human history. But certainly today, and especially with Israel back in the land, and the muscles and the sinew and the skin all taking shape, and yet there is no breath in them. So with all that, I want to come back actually to our lesson on the life of Jesus finally, and specifically, I want to relate all of that's going on. And again, the reason I thought it might be good, I'm just going to make this point one more time, is that today at sundown is Jerusalem Day, where the Jewish world and those who cherish God's dealings with Israel and all of its parts, and all of their parts, they celebrate that day in recent human history, 1967, when, against all probability, the city of Jerusalem was restored to the Jewish people. And it seems to me that's just one more piece of the stage, one more prop being slid into place, just the vase set on the table in just the right place for the drama to go up. But you do what you will with that. The point is that, again, we're going to relate it to today's lesson. And what I want to focus on is Jesus, the master teacher. And he tackles a difficult lesson. And again, and we've already reviewed this. It was late in Jesus' ministry when Jesus began to tell his disciples, Matthew 16:21, after spending the better part, or maybe a little more than 4 months, trying to get alone with them, finally got him up to the regions of Caesarea Philippi and told him he was going to die. And they were horrified. They were scandalized. And we've talked about that at length. But there is another element to that, sort of an addendum to that, is that he is going to die and that he is going to depart and come again at a latter day. And what I want to do is to sort of trace the remarkable strategy, the remarkable pedagogy of Jesus. As late in his ministry, he begins to introduce this staggering reality, the reality that he is going to actually depart. Now, I've said this to you before in sort of passing, but as a matter of fact, I mentioned it later, just recently, I think, as we talked about Peter's acknowledgement that the prophets themselves of the Old Testament tried to understand what manner of time the spirit of Messiah who was in them did signify when the Spirit talked about the sufferings of Messiah and the glory that should follow. And we said that we have an insight that takes all the work out of that, and that's two comings. And this reality of two comings, that Jesus was going to depart. Now, again, I'm going to say it's absolutely intuitively almost a part of what we believe as Bible-believing Christians, that Jesus came to suffer and he's going to come again to reign. But folks, put yourself in the moment. This was staggering. What you knew as a Jew living in the first century was that Messiah was soon to come, and that when he came, he would bring a kingdom. Now, Jesus had come and offered that kingdom, but by reason of rejection, as a matter of fact, I'm getting ahead of myself. So I'm going to walk through several stages, and I want to begin several stages of that pedagogical exercise, if you don't mind. I want you to we're going to trace how Jesus contrived so carefully, so patiently, so gently to introduce his disciples to this reality, that he was going to depart, be gone for a season, and then return to establish a kingdom. And I'm going to say again, this is unspeakably radical to Jesus' followers who are part of his ministry. All right, well, let me take you, first of all, to this chart. I just thought I'd return to this chart that we've used before. And this is a chart that overviews the ministry of Jesus. And we made much of the fact that you had, first of all, this period of public presentation, and then later on a period of private preparation as he sets out to tell his disciples he was going to die. But we made much of the fact that there are a couple of moments of rejection. And I want to start there. So, and those are right here. And the first moment of rejection, in other words, what we're saying is that Jesus, for the better part of 2 years, worked hard, going where the Jews were, doing miracles, openly claiming to be Messiah, God come in the flesh. And yet, once it was manifest that that generation was not going to receive Jesus as Messiah, that they were going to reject him, Jesus begins to turn toward private preparation. And this is in the record. It's absolutely clear in the record with regard to a couple of events where Jesus changes his tactics. And the first of those is the unpardonable sin in Matthew 12. Now, I want to go, so the point is that, let me just rehearse it real quickly. When Jesus does a miracle, this is Matthew 12, and quite frankly, we get lost in the question of what is the unpardonable sin. I'm not going to go there today, but at all, I've been there before, I think, with you, but that's really not the nub of this passage in terms of Jesus' ministry and the rhythm of Jesus' ministry. The real nub, what's really at stake in Matthew 12, is that Jesus does a miracle which is specifically, explicitly foretold by the prophet Isaiah, who said that that when Messiah came, he would open the eyes of the blind, loose the tongue of the dumb, and Jesus healed a man who was blind and dumb so that he both spake and saw. And when he did, the people said to the Pharisees, this isn't the son of David, right? Help us here. So they are asking for an excuse for disbelief. And when Jesus hears that, he begins to change his tactics. And actually, he begins to change his tactics on that very day. Let me point something out to you. This is kind of an interesting dynamic, I think. This is a chart that I put together called Jesus' Long Day or Jesus' Busy Day. And everybody who tries to study the life of Christ and harmonize the Gospels, comes to this very interesting exercise where you have the three synoptics recording a series of events, and one synoptic or another will place the subsequent event on the same day as the preceding event. So you have and I charted out here where it is that we're told it was the same day. But when you do, and I'm not going to spend any time with this other than to say that when you do the harmonizing work and you have explicit chronological connectors here, where Jesus returns home, and it's Mark who says that on the same day his brothers came to say, and then you have, all right, if I try and explain this, it'll get complicated, but you have the unpardonable sin, and then we're told by on the same day he spoke parables. So this is what's called Jesus' busy day. And all I want out of it here is to make the point that it was on the same day. It was on the afternoon. Let's say sometime in the morning, perhaps. I'm going to suggest, I want to go back to the scriptures here. Sometime early in the morning, perhaps, Jesus had this encounter where where he had done the miracle, and the people in the crowd had said, we're not going for it. Pharisees, help us out here. And so again, what you have, and it's right here, Matthew 13, on the same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the sea. On the same day as what? Well, on the same day as the unpardonable sin. So in Matthew 12, you have the unpardonable sin. On the same day, there's a lot more that goes on here that I'd love to talk about, but suffice it to say that, because this is really the nub of what I'm after. Now, again, what are we talking about here? We're talking about this remarkable pedagogical exercise that we can trace, where Jesus, realizing that this generation is committed to disbelief. Now, time out. I know some people are going to say, wait, is that fair to say that Jesus learned something? You bet it says. Jesus never entertained the notion that this generation was going to receive him. He knew better. He knew he was going to be rejected. I will argue that he knew it because he had discovered it in the scriptures. But the fact is that he came to his own, and his own received him not. And there was in that a deliberate, there is the implication of a very deliberate offer, and we have it recorded in the scriptures. So Jesus offered himself to this generation, to the generation to which he came. And when the common men, the common people began to side with Jesus' enemies, Jesus' enemies were long since upset with him by this point in his ministry. But when the common man said, hey, we don't know what to do with this miracle, with this evidence, but we're on your side, so help us out here. Is not the son of David right? Of course, the Pharisees come up with the Beelzebub charge, and they go for it. The common man goes for it. And Jesus discerns a level of hardness which demonstrates that they're not going to receive him, but also that it's getting dangerous. And so Jesus changes his tactics. And here on this afternoon, that is, I want to be at the same day. I don't know, maybe it was afternoon, evening, but later on the same day, after this gut-wrenching turning point experience that we remember as the unpardonable sin episode. Again, the unpardonable sin is not the big part of that. The real big element in there is that the common man had voiced his confession. He had announced his allegiance, and his allegiance was with the Pharisees, rather than with Jesus. And when the common man, because remember now, the crowds were Jesus' cover, they were his protection. And now when the crowds begin to say, help us out here, it's not the Son of Man, it's not the Son of David, right? Jesus begins to change his tactics. And one element of that is he has to introduce his disciples to the fact that he is going to be rejected, he is going to be killed, and that he is going to go away. And it really begins right here. On the same day when you have the crowds asking the Pharisees for an excuse for their disbelief, a crutch, if you don't mind, on that same day, Jesus begins to speak in parables. Now, I'm not going to go through the parables line by line by any means. I love to, but honest to goodness, folks, listen. Everybody who studies the parables thinks he understands it better than anybody else does. And quite frankly, I'm probably no exception. So forgive the hubris here. But honest to goodness, it staggers me the way this passage is often interpreted, because the parables are regarded as some sort of an overview of the church age or a description of the way the gospel is going to spread and so on. Folks, I'm going to say it again. You know what? I was reviewing one of my, it's painful to do, one of my earlier videos, and I realized I had misspoke in a really egregious and serious way, because I try and use this little bromide all the time. That, I mean, I often come back to this, that if you sit down to read the Bible and ask, what does this mean to me? Shame on you. Because what you need to ask first is, what does this mean? And what it means is a function of what the original speaker or author meant the original audience to understand. And that's all that it means. It's exactly what it means. The meaning is in the text. Now, this is where I misspoke myself. Because I say, if you sit down to read the Bible and say, what does this mean to me? Shame on you. You ask, what does it mean? But if having just mined out the meaning of the text, if you get up and leave without asking, what does this mean to me? Shame on you once again. So once you discover the meaning, then you ask, all right, how does this apply to me? But you start with meaning. And we got to ask ourselves, folks, not how might this apply, what might this be a picture of in our own life, our own experience, our own theology or whatever. And we get into how much of the, how many of the soils are believers and how many aren't. I think that it's not what Jesus is talking about. So I'm going to say, what we have to ask ourselves is, what is Jesus trying to say to those men on that afternoon, to the disciples, not to the crowds? I better get into the story, because this is what happens. It's again, Jesus, the master teacher. And he contrives, evidently spontaneously. I want you to, again, kind of get in the moment, because Jesus has done this miracle. He has heard the multitudes go to the Pharisees and say, get us out of this. It's not the man is the Son of David. And he's watched as they bought into the absolutely wicked and silly Beelzebub explanation. And Jesus realizes that the time has come to begin to move toward the cross. And he knows that his disciples, this is key, his disciples are totally befuddled by the masses. Now, time out real quickly. I'm not going to go there, but I have said that there is this document called, matter of fact, maybe I will go there because I think I have it here, so I can do it easily. There is this document that we've been using, I've been appealing to, called, it's on the same as the chart, 10 Important Insights. And one of those insights is that right here, number 8, that Jesus remained a wildly popular folk hero until the last week of his mortal life. So, and we've said this before and pointed out in the scriptures that listen, Jesus, I keep saying, was the best show in town. He didn't have trouble getting a crowd. He was far and away the best show in town. And so, and if you got to him, he healed you, whatever was ailing you, or your neighbor, or your friend, or your loved one. So the point is, Jesus had these crowds, and those crowds, and I say it's really Tuesday afternoon when Jesus drives them to a decision regarding the Pharisees. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees. Now, we talked about this when we were in the Passion Week, that's where this fascination finally sort of disappears sufficiently that his enemies can get to him. But the point is that I say here that this remarkable popularity, this wild-eyed fascination that the masses had with the Nazarene impacted Jesus' ministry in a couple of ways. And the first one is it deceived the apostles. Now, that's what it also covered him from his enemies. But my point here is simply that the disciples were convinced that this nation, this generation was going for it. He's got these huge crowds. But Jesus has discerned in that question, this isn't the Son of David, right? Jesus has discerned that this nation is giving its allegiance, as it were, to the Pharisaic leadership, and that leaves him in some little danger. And so now Jesus begins. Let me take you back to the scripture. So let's talk about the parables. This may be, I won't get through all of this today, I hope to, but let's just, so now, and I'm saying, let's get in the moment, because Jesus knows he's got to somehow get his disciples to understand that their eyes are deceiving them, that the crowds, the multitudes, the popularity, the fascination that they are witnessing, fascinating with Jesus, is all a superficial, self-serving facade. And he's got to introduce, so he begins to tell them parables. Now, let's just think about the parable as described, because Matthew does such a magisterial job. I'm sure he and the Spirit that enabled him, but it is such a good, and I'm sure they're congratulated to have me, commend their telling, but it's a marvelous telling. So let me begin in chapter 13, verse 1. The same day, Jesus went out of the house, sat by the sea. Great multitudes were gathered together. So he got into a boat and sat, and the whole multitude stood on the shore. There is a spot in Galilee, on the Sea of Galilee, called the Cove of the Sower. And it very likely, we can't be sure, but very likely is the place where this happened. It's very close to Capernaum. And it is a remarkable acoustical theater in nature. It's a natural acoustical phenomenon. And it's been called, and I think in modernity, maybe the Ibex folk who gave it the name, but it's called the Cove of the Sower. And in days gone by, when we would take people to Israel, we would stop. The bus it's just a 2-lane road. It comes around a bend, and so a lot of traffic and so on. But we would contrive to get off the bus. There used to be some ways that you could pull the bus off. Now it's built up, and they got a fence, and you can't do it. And I would normally make my way down to the shore, and I would have the students cross the road and go up on the hillside. And it's got to be 250, 300 yards, I would think, at least. And they're way up on the hillside. And I would go down and stand right on the edge of the shore, imagining, I didn't have a boat, but where Jesus would have been, just off the shore. And I would read this parable. Now, and the people way up on the hillside, who sometimes had trouble but picking me out down there in the bulrushes, they could just see me. They had to work at it, but they could hear me almost like I was standing next to them. And I wasn't screaming. I was deliberately projecting, but I wasn't screaming. And it's because there is this remarkable natural acoustical theater. And it was always a really thrill for people, because whether or not that's the specific place, and it very well could be where this happened, but it certainly makes the point that Jesus could speak to thousands and thousands of people. And they've done various estimates of about, I think it's in the above 10,000 people, some above the road, some beneath the road. The road wouldn't have been there in Jesus' day. It wasn't a road. But at any rate, now you can't do it today because they put a fence in, and they put somebody's got it used to be just kind of open, gnarly field, and now it's all banana plants and so on. They swallow up your voice. By the way, my dear friend and one-time student and long since mentor, Todd Bolin, that is, I've learned so much from him. Has a marvelous website called BiblePlaces.com. You need to spend time there. You need to, oh my goodness, so helpful. He has a regular podcast, not podcast, but a blog that he puts out on the weekends, just updating you on all things archaeological, historical, and museums and so on. Subscribe to it. It's fascinating. It's so helpful. And he has a set of pictures, which if you teach the Bible and you use any electronic media, you ought to have his Bible Places picture. They're absolutely peerless and magisterial, and really almost any book you look in that's published in the last 15 years or so, you look at some of their beautiful pictures and it'll say, you know, courtesy of Bible Places, Todd Boland. But if you go to BiblePlaces.com and just search on his site, Cove of the Sower, he has a description of this, and he also has a recording of him standing down there, and one of his students has gone way up on the side of the hill and is recording Todd's voice way down there. And again, you can hardly see him. He has a picture there. First time I ever did this, Todd was with me, and I think we were kind of experimenting, because I remember Todd saying, he was the leader, I was the follower, and he said, well, Bookman, you go down there and read. I'm going to go up here on this hillside. And honest to goodness, it was really sort of mystical, because I could just see him scurrying around up on that hillside, but the acoustics are such that I could hear him perfectly, and he could hear me. And it's because of the conical, the convex character is the word I want, the concave character of the hillside and so on. All right, I wandered. I'm not going to get anything done today, am I? All right, let's come back here. So let me make sure you understand where we're at. I am saying that Jesus is a master teacher. And one of the really remarkable pedagogical exercises that we can watch unfold in the course of his ministry, late in his ministry, is his introducing and driving home this reality that though he had come and offered the kingdom by reason of rejection, the kingdom was not going to be established. It was going to be delayed until he departed and came again. And the first hint of that, the first hint of both his coming death and his coming departure and return, is here when he takes his disciples. And so again, I lost my way. I set you up. So great multitudes were gathered together. He got in a boat and he sat, and the whole multitude stood on the shore, the whole multitude on this hillside. And he spoke many things to them in parables. He began speaking in parables. And here's his first parable. And I'm going to read it. Behold, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell by the wayside. The birds came and devoured them. Some fell on stony places where they didn't have much earth, and they immediately sprang up because they had no depth of earth. But when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. Some fell among thorns. The thorns sprang up and choked them. But others fell on good ground and yielded a crop, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Now, folks, I know everybody reads this, you know, there's such a beautiful picture of the spread of the gospel. And when you spread the gospel, everybody, okay. Listen, I'm going to put a spin on this. I understand this in a way that may be a little bit, I don't know, a little bit radical for you, but stay with me. I got the microphone, as it were. Because this is a remarkable story at one point, and one point only, and that is that it is so totally unremarkable. It is so totally that there's nothing about it that's interesting. Now, we think, we go back and we think, now, you know, so we draw pictures and we put up flannel graphs or PowerPoints, and we have the farmer with his bag at his side and taking it and casting it, and we point out that, and we say, isn't that interesting? Doesn't that? Yeah, it's interesting to us. But they watch this every year. They watched scores and hundreds of men do exactly this. They knew that when you broadcast the grain, some of it fell. You tried not to, but some of it got on the roadway, the pathway where everybody walks, and sure enough, that quick, the birds were there to pick it up. And some of it seemed like good. You'd done your best. You got in. You dug out the stones out of the soil. You tried to pull out all the. You tried to cultivate the soil as much as you could, but you knew very well some of it was going to fall on places where the soil was shallow and it wasn't going to last. You knew that some was going to fall among thorns and some among stones, and yet some was going to. My folks, look. This is what I like to say. Let me tell you a story. Here's a story to learn from. One day, a man's alarm went off. He got up, got dressed, went down to the kitchen, had breakfast. He got in his car and he went to work. Got a full day of work. He came home. He went in, had some supper, read a book, and went to bed. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. And you're saying, so what? That's what people do. That's how you live life. There is nothing remarkable about this parable. It's just exactly. And I think people were saying, what's that all about? Well, I could prove it to you, because here's the thing. Look what happens. The disciples came and said to him, why do you speak to them in parables? What is this all about? And Jesus said, now let me interrupt myself here. There was a season in my life. I was young. I had been in the pastorate for a long time, many, many months, about 16. And in God's sweet and careful providences, I was invited to return to my alma mater, to Pillsbury College, and to teach. And because I was in charge of pastor, I didn't know anything. And so at any rate, I taught homiletics. I always say that I think the angels didn't know whether to weep or laugh when they looked down and saw a young bookman teaching homiletics. But I did, and I read a lot of books. And every book I would read, they would have a section on illustrations, and it would begin with parables. And it would say, without a parable, Jesus didn't speak to him. And then it would talk about how parables are like illustrations, because they're kind of, they do illustrate, and they live in a little fresh air, and they, all these sort of things. Well, parables can be that, but I'm telling you, this parable was not designed to help people understand anything. It was designed specifically to confuse. Now that's what Jesus says. So his disciples come in and they say, why are you speaking this way? There's something about what Jesus had just done that was confusing to them. And he answered and said, here I am in verse 11, because it's been given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. All right, the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. Now, the standard, maybe in the dispensational world, but I think beyond as well, for many, many years, when especially Jesus talks about mystery, or Paul talks about mysteries, the explanation is, and I think it's entirely adequate and accurate, that in this case, a mystery is that which has not been revealed in the past, but is now going to be revealed. Something about God's revelation that was at least unspoken to and perhaps a bit confusing. But now there is further revelation that's going to make clear, or going to flesh out in this case. So there is something about the kingdom of heaven which has been hitherto unrevealed, and which now is going to be revealed by Jesus. Not, I think, only in seed form, the most basic primitive form here, but he is saying that there is something about the kingdom truth of Scripture that is hitherto unrevealed, and I'm not going to share it with this crowd. I'll explain why in just a moment, I think, but to you it is given. So let's be very careful, and let's ask ourselves, not what grand truth or what application or what insight might we glean from this parable. We're only going to ask ourselves, what is Jesus saying to those men, those disciples on that afternoon? Because he says, I've got something to tell you that hasn't been revealed before, but I'm not going to give it to them out there, and that is why I speak in parables. He goes on to say, look at here, for whoever has, to him more will be given, and he will have it in abundance. But whoever does not have, even that what he has will be taken away from him. Now, what is Jesus saying? He's saying, if you have accepted what I've taught you, you're going to be given more. But if you have rejected, as is the case with this crowd, how does Jesus know? Because this is late in the afternoon on the same day as when that morning, if you don't mind, sometime earlier in the day, Jesus had done a miracle. The people had said, we're not going for it. Give us an excuse. Okay, Beelzebub is good enough for us. And so Jesus knows that they have rejected the truth that he is presenting, the truth that he is the Messiah King. And now he is going to take away, even what he has will be taken away from him. Do you hear what's going on there? Jesus is saying this is a teaching device with a twofold purpose. For you who have accepted the truth, it's designed to introduce something hitherto unrevealed, something new. For those who have rejected the truth, it is designed to take away whatever little tiny bit of truth concerning Jesus. In other words, it's going to confuse them. And he says, therefore, I speak in parables. I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. And then he appeals to Isaiah 6, and he makes the point that this is a people who have thoroughly hardened themselves. How did he know that? I'm going to say it again. He knew it because of the earlier episode. Because in the face of a miracle specifically prophesied by Isaiah, in other words, that Jesus had demonstrated his bona fides as Messiah beyond any shadow of a doubt, and yet they had said, no, we don't want to go for it. Help us here. Okay, done by Beelzebub, that's good enough for us. And that is the evidence that they had hardened themselves so thoroughly that it was time to begin to take truth from them. And I think take truth from them in this particular case because it was so important, because Jesus, he wanted to protect himself. Now, Jesus, that is, if these people are not going to insulate me from the anger of the Pharisees, if they're siding with my Pharisaic enemies, then I need to find another tactic. And I'm going to suggest that tactic in a minute. But notice what he goes on to say. Blessed are your eyes, and blessed are your eyes, for they see, your ears, for they hear. For assuredly I say, many prophets and righteous men desired to see what you see, and did not see it. Now, I wonder if Peter's in the room when Jesus is giving this instruction to the 12 privately. And I wonder if he doesn't have this mind, this statement of Jesus somewhat banging around in his head when Peter writes in his epistle that the prophets themselves wondered what manner of time the Spirit of Christ did signify when he testified beforehand the sufferings of Christ and the glory that should follow. That's what Peter testifies to late in his life. But the point is, he's saying that the Old Testament prophets themselves were confused about how Messiah could both suffer and reign, and Jesus is about to introduce the insight, to give them the insight to understand exactly that. And ultimately, that insight is rejection, death, burial, and resurrection, departure, and then a return, two comings. And that's so he's saying, the prophets and righteous men tried to understand what it is, but I'm going to tell you something. And what is it? Well, let me just go a little further and I'll come back to it. Therefore, hear the parable of the sower. Now, this is what you need to understand. And this is a tremendously important hermeneutical tool, I think, in understanding this parable and all of them. That Jesus spoke the parable to the masses, to the multitudes, but he gave the interpretation only to the disciples. He's speaking to the disciples here. And he gives the interpretation. Now you're familiar. It is that I'll read it. Therefore, hear the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom, all right, I got to stop there, folks. This is the kingdom of the Old Testament. Listen, there is the persuasion almost universal. And I'm going to level with you. Many of you who are listening today, and I appreciate it tremendously, and I'm making merchandise of your kindness in being with me here a little bit. But I want to challenge a set of ideas which is embraced almost universally. And that is that what is happening in Matthew 13 in the parables, in the series of parables, is Jesus is at some level or another redefining the kingdom. That in the Old Testament, the kingdom was a physical kingdom, but in the New Testament, it's a spiritual kingdom. Now, amillennialism, historical postmillennialism, or historical premillennialism, and so on, they basically, certainly postmillennialism, they would regard the kingdom as totally redefined. They'd say it's not for Israel. In the case of amills and postmills, it's not even a physical kingdom. They would say it's but at some level, it's being redefined as a spiritual kingdom. And even dispensational premillennialists. In most cases, I'm the odd man out here. I'm not the only guy, but there are many of us. I do not believe that there is any sense in which the kingdom is with us today. It's anticipated. And we have been translated into the kingdom of his dear son in the sense that the Old Testament prophetic perfect sense that it's as good as done, just as in the parallel verse in Ephesians, we have been made to sit in heavenly places. In heaven. We're not in heaven yet, but it's as good as done. So I'm just saying that I do not believe that the kingdom is here today. I think the kingdom is entirely 100% future. It is the kingdom promised in the Old Testament. And so I don't think that Jesus is redefining the kingdom, or that he's adding a dimension of kingdom truth in terms of a spiritual kingdom, which is God's reign in our hearts. Praise God that he reigns in our hearts. Praise God that he's king of your life. That doesn't make a kingdom. The kingdom, as described in the Old Testament, is literal. It is worldwide. It is a kingdom of absolute righteousness and justice and peace. It's a kingdom where the knowledge of the glory of the Lord covers the earth as water covers the sea, where every knee bows and every tongue confesses that Jesus is the Christ. That simply is not going on at your house, in your town, or in my town. And so there is no need to compromise or eviscerate the kingdom concept of the Old Testament. When Jesus says, when anybody hears the word of the kingdom, he simply means the kingdom of the Old Testament, that God is going to establish a kingdom on this earth under the rule of Messiah, and that the only way to be part of it is to repent of your sins and trust in the promised deliverer and the provision of a sin covering, all of which is Jesus, and so on. That's kingdom truth, and that kingdom is yet to come. All right, so I wander, forgive me, but so he says, when anyone hears the word of the kingdom and doesn't understand it, then the wicked one, in other words, immediately just turns away for it. The wicked one, I lost my way here. All right, right here. Then the wicked one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. This is he received the seed by the wayside, a little bit that fell on the pathway. But he received the seed on stony places. This is he who hears the word, immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no root. And so he endures for a little while, but when any tribulation or trial comes along, he stumbles. Now, the one who received seed among the thorns is one who hears the word, but the cares of this world, the deceitfulness of the world, he becomes unfruitful. But he who received the good ground is he who hears the word of God and understands it. All right, now, what is Jesus saying? What is the point of this parable? Folks, I would argue, now be in the moment, be in the moment. The disciples knew that when seed was sown, some was plucked away immediately, some fell among thorns, stones, shallow soil. They knew all that. Why would Jesus lay this out for them? I am persuaded that Jesus is saying this. He is saying to his disciples, gentlemen, this is not going nearly as well as you think it is. He is trying for the very first time and it's the first time. It's just after that unpardonable sin, that rejection episode, and now Jesus gets alone with his disciples, says, I got something to tell you. And prophets have longed to understand it, and it's a mystery. It's never been revealed before. It has to do with God's kingdom program. And the first mini lesson you need to know is this. This is not going nearly as well as you think it is. I think that's all that he's saying. You're seeing these great multitudes. Everybody seems so excited. You need to know that there's a lot of. Now you see the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they're like the seed that was cast on the wayside and immediately was plucked away. There's no mystery in that, but I mean, that's not hard to understand. But what you can't see and what you need to know, and what I'm going to use a very earthy, homey, familiar illustration to try and get into your heads is this, that a lot of what you see out there is the sudden growth in stony soil, in thorny soil, in shallow soil, and it's not going to last. And he goes on to say, now he gives some more parables. But he's speaking to his disciples. And in the next parable, he talks about the seed that is the tares among the wheat. And it's going to take the angels in the end of time to sort it all out. I'm always kind of, I don't know, it's kind of off-putting to me or disturbing to me that we oftentimes spend so much time in the first parable saying, okay, which of those soils is really saved? You know, are these saved? Well, the next, seems to me the next parable, Jesus is saying, you're not going to be able to sort it out. And Judas is the preeminent example of that. One of the 12 is, in fact, I would say thorny soil, because the thorn of thievery has grown up around his heart. And so I don't know. You can get into that question. I don't think Judas was saved by any means, but my point is simply that's not Jesus' point. And he's not saying, here's a little word picture that will help you understand the thread of the gospel over the rest of the gospel age. Why would he do that? That's not what he did. Listen, the old bromide. The Bible was written for you. It was not written to you. It was written to that generation. And Jesus spoke this parable to that generation, and he interpreted it to his disciples. And so I believe, I'm just going to leave it alone, but the parables themselves, I think what Jesus, let me just summarize it, and then I'll try and isolate it. The parables themselves, I think, again, on that afternoon, just a few hours after the people had rejected Jesus' miracle or accepted the Pharisaic explanation of Jesus' miracle. And I don't think the disciples understood that. It was pretty subtle. They didn't get it. But Jesus understood what was afoot. So now he gets his disciples. First of all, he speaks this parable. Now, let me say one other thing here before I go any further. And please, this is, I'm waxing bold to speculate wildly. But I think there's a profound sense in which the life of certain Old Testament heroes anticipated the life of Messiah, or when they were noble, they provided a sort of a pattern into which Messiah would be pressed and express himself perfectly. And one of the most important is David. And there is a time where David, after he flees from Saul, he finally realizes that Saul is absolutely intent on killing him, and he flees. And he makes a strategic mistake, a very serious strategic mistake. He thinks that maybe because he is now an enemy of Saul, he would be befriended by Saul's enemies, and he goes to Gath. And the king, he goes into Gath, and he tries to make that case, and they're not going for it. And he realizes he's in danger. And so to use the very expressive old King James description of it, he began to drool in his beard. This is David. And the point is that David feigned madness in order to get away. All right, now, folks, I wonder if there is not something of that in Jesus' strategy here. Because, again, you've got to understand, and it gets worse. Maybe I should go back and say there's more to this day even than what I've mentioned explicitly. Because the day begins with Jesus coming back to Capernaum and his own family coming to take him home, thinking him to be mad. And then you have the whole unpardonable sin episode, and Jesus retires into a house, and some people come. This is Mark chapter 3, verse 31. Some people come and say, your mother and your brothers are out there, and they want to take you home. And Jesus, of course, has to say, who is my mother and who are my brothers? Are not you that believe? Now, don't you suppose that ripped the heart out of our Savior? Do you think it was with a dry cheek that Jesus gave his allegiance to his Father in heaven, even if it meant rejecting at some level his family here on earth? So it's been a traumatic day. It's been highlighted by this demonstration on the part of the people that they were not going to embrace his message, that they were going to give their allegiance, if you don't mind, to the Pharisaic enemies of Jesus. And now Jesus, in that situation, he goes down to the seaside, he puts out in a boat, quiets the crowd. Oh, it would have been easy. I'm sure, I'm confident, it doesn't say it explicitly. His disciples were probably seated there because, again, that's how you signaled the fact that the rabbi is about to speak. He's assumed the posture. Shh, he's going to speak again. And imagine now, Jesus quiets the crowd, and he tells this story. Man went out to sow, some on the wayside, some in thorny soil, didn't do so well, some in shallow soil, didn't do so well, some in rocky soil, didn't so, some in good soil did really well. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Again, I'm going to say, if you're there that afternoon, you're sitting there saying, yeah, what's that all about? That doesn't make any sense at all. He hadn't said anything. He might as well have told us that the sun comes up in the east and goes down in the west, and then he who hears it. So my point is, I really think that Jesus is sort of representing himself as at least innocuous, because again, he has just discerned that his cover, that is the cover that provided him by the people, may be dissipating, may be waning. But however you like it, I think Jesus is very, and again, you have in this context, now it's earlier in the day, but you have in this context, it's in Mark chapter 3, that his family comes thinking, to take him home, thinking him to be mad. So that's out there. And I wonder if Jesus isn't sort of, but again, and here's where I want to take you. It's part of a remarkably clever, strategic teaching strategy. Because having spoken the parable in public, he takes his disciples come to him, and he says, I'm doing this to take away what the unbelieving think they have, but I'm giving you something you haven't had before. And prophets have longed to look into it. And then he simply says, interpreting the parable, he's just using a very homey illustration to make the point, this is not going nearly as well as you think. So I'm going to sum up this day. I think this is the first step in Jesus' remarkable pedagogical strategy to ultimately, which is going to be, by the way, what he continues to articulate, to speak, and we'll talk about this next Tuesday, what he continues to work at teaching, let's put it that way, again and again, throughout his ministry and after. Matter of fact, maybe I'll take a Revelation just by way of conclusion. But at any rate, the point is that this is the first time he's going to address this really, really difficult lesson. And again, the lesson is this isn't going nearly as well as you think. Let me sum it up. I think that's the sum of the parables. What Jesus is communicating to the disciples is this. Number one, these crowds are illusory in terms of genuine devotion. These are you're being confused by the crowds. And you need to know that this isn't going nearly as well as you think it is. There is a lot of shallow, a lot of stony, a lot of thorny soil out there, as well as the hard-packed wayside soil. But come to grips with it. This isn't doing. Now, he's going to say the same thing later on when he gets in a boat and says, all right, I probably have to tell you this whole story, but in the process of trying to get alone with his disciples just some weeks after this, and he makes his way into Galilee, and a Pharisee pops out and says, show us a sign. He gets back in the boat, and he says to his disciples, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And remember, they say, well, he must be upset because we didn't bring any sandwich. And Jesus, what are you talking about? I fed 5,000, I fed 4,000, you picked up 12 baskets, you picked up 7 baskets. I'm telling you, beware the doctrine of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the teaching. Why? Because again, the disciples were confused because everywhere Jesus went, he had wildly excited crowds. And there were always these picky Pharisees and Sadducees, and they're thinking, it's not a big deal. And what he is saying is that it's going to leaven the lump. That's what he says in that passage, in later on. But the point is, I lose my way. Come back here. I think what's going on in Matthew 13 is, number one, it's not going nearly as well as you think it is. Number two, clinging to the hope of Jesus as Messiah and the kingdom he's going to bring is going to cost you something. Now that's huge, because up until this point, it hasn't. I mean, they are riding on a wave, the disciples are. They have come to the persuasion by the Spirit's ministry and through examination of the Old Testament scriptures and by reason of Jesus' miracles and so on, They have come to the persuasion this man is what he claims to be, as difficult as it is. He is the Messiah, and we are the inner circle. We are the chosen ones. We get to travel with him. They have just been riding that wave of popularity and fascination and excitement, and they're getting to bask in the shadow of this Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus is saying, it's not going to be like this. You're going to pay a dear price. And so he says, first of all, it's going to take the end times, it's going to take the angels to sort everything out, but no, it's not going so well. And I think the mustard seed is, in fact, he says the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. And I think he is making the point. And I know there's some question about this, the smallest seed. Okay, it's the smallest visible seed. But the point is, he is saying that as tiny as it is, it can grow into something that can give. I think it's a contrast. I think what Jesus is saying is, you're looking at these crowds, you're thinking, wow, this is marvelous. But you're being deceived. On the other hand, there is a remnant, there is the good soil that brings forth, and so it's going to grow. He's talking about the kingdom, and he's not talking about the kingdom today. He's talking about as tiny as the hope is today, as if you could see the hearts of men, if you could understand. And Jesus discerned the hearts of men because he had that unfallen mind, and he understood the scriptures, and he knew where men were and spiritually, whereas the disciples were being deceived. And he's saying, if you could see, you'd see that there's a lot of bad soil out there, and it's not going to last. But there's a remnant. It's fallen on good soil, and it's going to grow. And so hold on to it. Now let me tell you a story, because it's a point I want to make that I made earlier. I remember, and I've told you a couple of times stories where somebody said to me, and I came back with this really quick rejoinder, and I'm not good at it, but remember this, that I'm getting quite old, and the older you get, I always say, the better your memory gets, because today I can remember things whether they happened or not, but I'm pretty sure this happened. I remember this quite well, that the student said to me one time, he read this parable. It was in class in a Bible Institute of sorts, and we were going through this, and he read that parable, and he said, look, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard, a little tiny, it grows and greater than the herbs, and it becomes a tree, it becomes a bush tree, whatever, and the birds of the air can come and nest in its branches, and it does. And he said, to me, that is the church. How can it be anything but the church? Because think about it, it fits so perfectly. It's just a little tiny. So the kingdom of heaven is the church. And think about it. It starts out so small, and it's grown today. Believers in every age, in every place, this grand universal church, that's got to be the church. It just fits so perfectly. How could it be anything else? And I said to him, well, it does fit, and that's an interesting interpretation, but I'll tell you what I think. This doesn't work anymore. But I said to him, I think that the kingdom of heaven is Sears and Roebuck. Because, I don't know, I think this is the case. Two guys, they invent some blue jeans, they write a catalog, it's just two guys, and today, everywhere you go, we used to be so, there's a Sears, and if it's raining, you can go inside and get out of the rain. So I think it's Sears and Roebuck. And he walked into my trap, because he said, well, that's crazy. They never heard of Sears and Roebuck. Think, they never heard of the church. The idea that Jesus on this afternoon is describing the universal church, he's describing the course. They don't even know there's going to be an interregnum. That's what he's trying to teach. So I'm going to say it again. The only question before the house is, what is he saying to those men on that afternoon? And what he is saying, I believe, is that you can have hope. It starts small, a lot smaller than you think, because there's a lot of bad soil out there. It's got you boondoggled, but you need to understand, buddy. And then he goes on to the leaven, and I think his point there is, just as it was later, that the rejection that you see as not very important is going to grow. And he explains I'm not going to go through them, but these two right here, the parable of the treasure hidden in a field, and then the pearl of great price. Again, what he is saying is, cling to the kingdom hope. Now, I've heard people represent this as salvation. You don't want to make it salvation. It's not the point at all. It might be an ancillary point, but that is, you can't have a kingdom hope unless you, in fact, are saved. But what's at stake here is this simple truth that Jesus claims to be the Messiah who is going to establish a kingdom. You disciples are convinced that the whole world is going for it. You're wrong. And furthermore, you need to understand that the rejection that you regard as incidental and annoying is going to grow and leaven the whole lump, and it's going to cost you dearly to cling to the truth that Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah and that he is going to establish a kingdom. And that's exactly what happens. Certainly in the book of Acts and then beyond, where there is so much persecution of those who would cling to the hope that Jesus is the promised Messiah. Now, all Jesus is saying to these men on that afternoon is, you're on a roll here, you're enjoying it, you're the center of attention, you're the spotlight, but you need to know you're going to pay dearly. And it's going to cost you something. And then he concludes here in Matthew. Now there's another one in Mark, but I'll stay here in Matthew with the dragnet, again making the point that I think, coming back to the original point, folks, there is such a carefully crafted teaching mechanism here, a teaching strategy, where he starts out with a parable of the sower. It's not going nearly as well as you think. It's going to take the angels in the end times to sort it out. But hold on to it. Know that it's going to get ugly, and that is the wickedness is going to spread, and you're going to have to cling. You're going to have to pay a great price to cling to the hope that Jesus is Messiah. But know this: at the end of the age, God's going to drag that, and he's going to separate the wicked from the just, and only at that time will the kingdom be established. So I was going to go through the whole series, but I'm not going to do it. Let me just review this and make two other points. First of all, what I'm saying to you is that that late in his ministry, in response to what is clear demonstration of generational rejection of Jesus' claims, Jesus begins to change his tactics. And as he does, he contrives on the fly a remarkable teaching strategy where he speaks a parable which is designed by his own testimony to confuse the masses. A teaching methodology which was the result of the reality that generation had hardened itself. That's what he says. I'm teaching this way because in them Isaiah's promise of hardness has come to pass. But then he privately gives the interpretation. And as simple as the illustration is, it is designed, it is intended, I think it is probably effective at some initial seminal state. It is intended to introduce the disciples to the reality that, number one, this is not going nearly as well as you think. And furthermore, there's a lot of bad soil. It's going to take the angels to sort it out. But cling to the hope. The wickedness is going to spread through the lump, and the nation is going to reject me, this generation. And you're going to have to cling. It's going to cost you something to cling to kingdom hope. Not just kingdom hope, but the hope that Messiah is Jesus. Jesus is the one who's going to bring the kingdom. And you know why? One of the reasons it's going to be so hard to hold on to that, because he's going to go away and be gone for a couple of thousand years. Now, I don't think they could have read that into that, but that's what Jesus is saying. You have to learn to cling to the kingdom hope. And it's only in the end of time when the dragnet comes. Now, I want to just say that Jesus ends this with a sort of a teaching parable. Because he says, and if you'd have been there that day, I wonder how sincere they are in verse 51, but Jesus says, have you understood all these things? Do you get it? And they all said, yeah, Lord. So let's assume that at some level, they had begun to understand that it wasn't going nearly as well as it seemed. But then Jesus says something that is so timely. Because he says in verse 52, every scribe instructed concerning the kingdom of heaven. If you're really going to be well taught concerning the kingdom of heaven, you got to be like a householder who brings out of his treasure, and treasure here just means larder or pantry, his storage cabinet. He brings out of his treasure things new and old. What's this all about? Well, Jesus is simply saying, you see, this is in a day when day by day you would go to market every morning, because in preparing the food for the day, you had to have some stuff that was old. It aged, you kept it, whether it was salted meats or whatever it might be that you keep in storage. But a lot of things you had to go buy fresh. So day by day, you would buy the fresh meats and the fresh fish and the fresh vegetables and so on. So a good householder, somebody who's in charge of the house, prepares the meal. He's a rich man. He's got a man who is his householder. And every morning he goes out and he knows how to use both that which is old and that which is new. What is Jesus saying? I think he is warning deliberately against the amillennial interpretation of this passage. Because we're told that in Matthew 13, Jesus is totally redefining the kingdom. The whereas in the Old Testament was physical, literal, on earth. In the New Testament, right here, Matthew 13, Jesus makes it spiritual. It's just the gospel. Well, to put that spin on this passage is to defy Jesus' instruction when he said, don't be tossing out what is old when you embrace that which is new. That's what he's saying. Bring with you everything your scriptures ever said about the kingdom. Embrace that, cherish that, but now I'm giving you something new. And that which is new is simply this. This isn't going as well as you think. It's going to be rejected. You're going to pay a cost. You're going to have to cling to the hope that Jesus is what he claims to be. But the day is coming when God will sort it all out and honor those who obey him. So I would argue that this is the first step it's a step that was evidently kind of spontaneously conceived. It's genius. But now Jesus is going to spend a good deal of time. Let me just draw it to a close by going to Revelation. And I'm going to close the same place next time, but it's just interesting to me that this hope that Jesus is coming again is easily lost. And in the last chapter of our Bible, and in the red letters that, behold, I am coming quickly. And again, behold, I am coming quickly. My reward is with me. And then he finally, surely I am coming quickly at the end of the chapter here. Can't get it on the screen. But the fact is that, folks, let me draw it all together. I started out by talking about Jerusalem Day. As the sun goes down tonight, Jews across the world and those who cherish what God is still doing with Israel will celebrate a remarkable event and stunningly unprecedented event in 1967, when Jerusalem once again became the capital of the Jewish people, the Jewish state. And I would just suggest that even in our own day, it's awful easy to fall in with the spirit of Peter gets after in 2 Peter 3, that ever since the fathers fell asleep, we've heard the same stuff. And so it's been 2,000 years. Folks, what's happening in Israel today and what we celebrate, especially what is celebrated on Jerusalem Day, is God's Ebenezer. I remember Ebenezer is a stone that was raised up by Samuel to make this point, that God has brought us this far, he'll take us the rest of the way. And what God is doing in terms of putting bones together and sinew and flesh and muscle together, even though there's no spirit in them, that's Ebenezer. And the fact is, one of Jesus' most prodigious teaching stewardships was to introduce his disciples to this reality, that he was going to depart, be gone a time, and then return. And in point of fact, that's going to happen. And Jesus left us with these words ringing in our ears: behold, I come quickly. And we have even events today that ought to perhaps function as something of a reminder, an Ebenezer. Jesus is in fact going to reign on this earth. All right. Well, amen and amen. Thank you once again for being with me. And I was going to get through this entire thing. We'll pick it up next time. But God bless, and we'll see you on Tuesday if the Lord will.